You reach for it again, don't you? That familiar pull, that magnetic draw towards something you can't quite name. Your hand moves almost without thought, your mind already racing ahead to the moment of contact, the surge, the brief electric feeling that promises to fill the hollow space inside your chest. But even as you chase it, even as you surrender to the craving, you know the truth. You've known it for a while now. The moment it's over, the emptiness returns, deeper than before, more pronounced, like an echo in a canyon that only grows louder with each repetition. This isn't about weakness. This isn't about moral failure or lack of willpower. This is about something far more profound, something that Carl Jung spent decades trying to help us understand. Because what you're experiencing isn't desire at all. It's the soul's desperate attempt to communicate with you in the only language it knows how. And if you're honest with yourself, really honest, you'll recognize that every time you reach for that temporary fix, you're not moving towards something. You're running from something else entirely. Tonight, I want to take you on a journey into the hidden mechanics of human longing. Not the surface-level explanations you've heard before, not the quick fixes or the shame-based solutions, but the deep psychological architecture that Jung discovered beneath our most persistent cravings. Because what he found will change how you see your own desires forever. You see, there's a pattern here that most people never recognize. They think desire is about wanting more, but Jung revealed something shocking. Most of what we call desire is actually a sophisticated defense mechanism. A way of avoiding the one thing our psyche fears most, not pain, not rejection, not even death, but emptiness, the raw, unfiltered experience of our own inner void. And here's what makes this so insidious. The very thing we use to escape the emptiness actually creates more of it. Every time you reach for that quick hit of satisfaction, you're training your nervous system to believe that fulfillment lives outside of you. You're teaching your soul that it can't be trusted to provide what you need. And so the void grows larger, hungrier, more demanding. But Jung saw something else, something that gives me hope. And by the end of this exploration, I believe it will give you hope too. Because hidden within your deepest cravings is a map, a psychological GPS system that's been trying to guide you home to yourself all along. You just haven't learned how to read it yet. Think about the last time you felt that familiar ache. Not physical hunger, not thirst, but that restless energy that makes you scroll endlessly, that makes you seek out stimulation, that makes you feel like you're suffocating in your own skin. Most people interpret this as a signal that they need something external: food, entertainment, connection, achievement, validation. But Jung would ask you a different question. What if that ache isn't pointing you towards something you lack? What if it's pointing you towards something you've abandoned? This is where Jung's understanding becomes revolutionary. He didn't see unfulfilled desire as a problem to be solved, but as a symptom of a deeper disconnection. A disconnection from what he called the self with a capital S. Not the ego self, not the personality you present to the world, but the deeper, more authentic core of who you are, beneath all the roles and masks and performances. When you're connected to this deeper self, desire doesn't disappear, but it transforms. It becomes less frantic, less desperate, less consuming. It becomes more like a gentle current than a raging river. Because when you're rooted in your authentic being, you don't need external things to fill internal voids. The void itself begins to close. But here's the catch, and this is where most people get stuck. To reconnect with your authentic self, you have to be willing to sit with the emptiness first. You have to stop running from it, stop medicating it, stop trying to fill it with temporary pleasures. You have to turn toward it with curiosity instead of fear. Jung called this process individuation, the gradual integration of all the scattered parts of your psyche into a coherent whole. But before integration comes disintegration. Before wholeness comes the honest acknowledgement of fragmentation. And this is where desire plays its most crucial role. Your cravings are breadcrumbs leading you back to the parts of yourself you've disowned. Every time you feel that magnetic pull towards something external, Jung would encourage you to pause and ask, not, how do I get rid of this feeling? But what is this feeling trying to show me about myself? Because embedded in every desire is information, not about what you need to acquire, but about what you need to reclaim. The man who constantly craves sexual validation might discover he's actually craving his own tenderness. The woman who endlessly seeks achievement might find she's actually seeking her own approval. The person who can't stop consuming content might realize they're actually hungry for their own creativity. This is the psychological alchemy Jung discovered, the ability to transform the lead of compulsive desire into the gold of authentic self-knowledge. But it requires a fundamental shift in how you relate to your own cravings. Instead of seeing them as enemies to be defeated or masters to be obeyed, you begin to see them as messengers carrying vital information about your inner landscape. And here's where it gets really interesting. Jung noticed that the people who struggled most with compulsive desires were often the most creative, the most sensitive, the most spiritually inclined. Not because they were more flawed, but because they were more aware. Their souls were trying to communicate something important, and the only language they knew was the language of longing. This is why traditional approaches to desire often fail. They treat the symptom instead of addressing the underlying disconnection. They focus on behavior modification instead of soul integration. They ask you to become smaller, more controlled, more disciplined. But Jung's approach asks you to become more whole. The emptiness you're trying to fill isn't actually empty. It's full of unlived potential, unexpressed creativity, unacknowledged parts of yourself that have been waiting in the shadows for your attention. When you learn to listen to these parts instead of silencing them with temporary pleasures, something magical happens. The desperate quality of desire begins to fade, replaced by something more sustainable and nourishing. But this process isn't easy, and it's definitely not quick. It requires you to develop what Jung called active imagination, the ability to dialogue with the different aspects of your psyche, to give voice to the parts of yourself that have been speaking through cravings and compulsions. It means learning to sit with discomfort without immediately reaching for relief. It means questioning the stories you tell yourself about what you need to be happy. It means being willing to discover that some of your most persistent desires are actually misinterpretations of deeper psychological needs. And, most challenging of all, it means accepting that the very thing you've been running from, the emptiness itself, might actually be the doorway to the fullness you've been seeking all along. This is just the beginning of our exploration into Jung's radical understanding of desire and emptiness. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into the specific mechanisms he discovered, the practical tools he developed, and the profound transformation that becomes possible when you stop fighting your cravings and start listening to them instead. Because what Jung found in his decades of working with the human psyche will challenge everything you think you know about desire, fulfillment, and what it means to live an authentic life. And more importantly, it will give you a completely new way of relating to the emptiness that might just transform it from your greatest enemy into your most trusted guide. But before we go deeper, I need to tell you something that might disturb you. Something Jung discovered that most therapists won't share because it threatens the very foundation of how we think about healing. The emptiness you're trying to escape. It's not a bug in your psychological system. It's a feature. It's not something that went wrong. It's something that's trying to go right. Here's what I mean. Jung spent years analyzing his own psyche, diving into what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. And what he found there wasn't pretty. Dreams filled with terrifying figures, fantasies that seemed to come from nowhere, desires that made no rational sense. But instead of trying to make these experiences go away, he did something radical. He began to dialogue with them. He discovered that the emptiness isn't actually empty. It's pregnant with possibility. It's the space where your unlived life is waiting to be born. But most of us never get there because we're too busy filling that space with distractions, with quick fixes, with anything that will make the discomfort stop. Think about it this way. You know that moment right before you reach for your phone, right before you open that app, right before you seek out that temporary rush. There's a pause there, a split second of pure potential. In that pause lives everything you've been looking for. But we move through it so quickly we never actually experience it. Jung would call this the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism that bridges the gap between conscious and unconscious, between what you think you want and what your soul actually needs. But it only activates when you're willing to stay present with the discomfort instead of immediately moving to resolve it. This is where most people fail. They think the goal is to eliminate the emptiness, to fill the void, to make the craving go away. But Jung discovered something counterintuitive. The goal isn't to fill the emptiness. The goal is to befriend it, to learn its language, to understand what it's trying to communicate. Because here's the thing about psychological voids. They're not random, they're not meaningless, they're precisely shaped, like a key that's been cut to fit a very specific lock. And what they're shaped to receive isn't more stimulation, more pleasure, more external validation. They're shaped to receive the lost parts of yourself. Let me give you an example. There was a patient Jung wrote about, a successful businessman who couldn't stop himself from having affairs, not because he was particularly lustful, but because he felt dead inside his marriage, dead inside his career, dead inside his own skin. Every affair was an attempt to feel alive again, to feel desired, to feel something other than the gray numbness that had become his default state. But Jung didn't focus on the affairs. He focused on the deadness. What had this man killed inside himself to become successful? What parts of his personality had he sacrificed to fit into the role of respectable businessman? What dreams had he abandoned? What aspects of his creativity had he suppressed? As they worked together, something remarkable happened. The man began to reconnect with parts of himself he'd forgotten existed. His love of music, his fascination with philosophy, his desire to create something meaningful. And as these lost parts came back to life, the compulsive need for affairs began to fade. Not because he forced himself to stop, but because the void they were trying to fill was no longer empty. This is what Jung meant by individuation. Not self-improvement, but self-recovery. Not becoming someone new, but remembering who you've always been beneath the layers of conditioning and compromise. But here's where it gets tricky. Your psyche is smarter than you think. It knows exactly which desires will get your attention. If you're someone who prides yourself on being disciplined, it might manifest as an eating disorder. If you're someone who values control, it might show up as an addiction. If you're someone who's afraid of intimacy, it might appear as compulsive sexual behavior. The specific form doesn't matter. What matters is recognizing that these aren't random malfunctions. They're your unconscious mind's way of forcing you to pay attention to something you've been ignoring. Jung had a name for this phenomenon. He called it enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposite when taken to an extreme. The person who tries to be perfectly good often finds themselves plagued by dark thoughts. The individual who pursues absolute control often experiences complete loss of control. The one who avoids all risk often finds themselves taking dangerous risks. Your desires are following this same pattern. They're showing up in the exact form that will force you to confront what you're avoiding. And what most people are avoiding isn't their desires themselves, but the emptiness those desires are trying to point them toward. Because that emptiness isn't actually threatening. It's sacred. It's the space where transformation becomes possible. It's the pregnant void from which new life emerges. But to access its creative potential, you have to stop trying to escape it and start learning to inhabit it. This requires what Jung called a religious attitude toward your own psyche. Not religious in the traditional sense, but in the sense of treating your inner experience as sacred, as meaningful, as worthy of respect and attention. It means approaching your desires with curiosity rather than judgment, with reverence rather than shame. When you do this, something shifts. The frantic quality of desire begins to settle. The desperate reaching for external solutions starts to quiet. And in that quietness, you begin to hear something you've been missing all along. The voice of your authentic self, calling you home. But this voice doesn't speak in words. It speaks in images, in dreams, in synchronicities, in the precise shape of your emptiness. Learning to listen to this language is perhaps the most important skill you can develop. Because once you understand what your psyche is trying to tell you, you can finally give it what it actually needs instead of what it's been asking for. And what it needs is rarely what you think. The person craving constant stimulation might actually need deep rest. The individual seeking endless validation might actually need to validate themselves. The one running from emptiness might actually need to dive deeper into solitude. This is the paradox Jung discovered at the heart of human psychology. We get what we need by going toward what we're avoiding. We find fullness by embracing emptiness. We discover our authentic desires by stopping our pursuit of false ones. But this transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's a process that unfolds in stages, each one requiring you to develop a deeper tolerance for uncertainty, for discomfort, for the space between what you've known and what you're becoming. In the beginning stages, you might find yourself caught between two worlds. The old world where desire was your master, pulling you toward endless distractions, and this new world where desire becomes your teacher, showing you the way back to yourself. This transition period is disorienting. Your nervous system, accustomed to quick fixes and immediate gratification, rebels against the slower rhythm of authentic fulfillment. Jung called this the nigredo, the blackening phase of psychological transformation. Everything that once brought you pleasure now feels hollow. The activities that used to fill your time feel meaningless. The relationships that once satisfied you reveal their superficial nature. It's as if you're waking up from a dream, only to discover that what you thought was real was just an elaborate illusion. This is where most people turn back. They interpret this darkness as evidence that something has gone wrong, that they've made a mistake in questioning their old patterns. The familiar voice of doubt whispers, "At least before you were satisfied sometimes. Now you're just empty all the time." But Jung understood this phase as absolutely necessary. You can't build something new on a foundation that's already crumbling. First, the false structures must fall away. During this period, your relationship with emptiness begins to evolve. At first, it feels like an enemy, something to be feared and avoided at all costs. Then it becomes a teacher, showing you the difference between what you thought you wanted and what you actually need. But eventually, if you're patient, if you're willing to stay present with the process, emptiness transforms into something else entirely. It becomes a friend, a companion, a doorway to depths you never knew existed within yourself. This shift happens when you stop trying to analyze the emptiness and start learning to inhabit it. Instead of asking, "How do I get rid of this feeling?" you begin asking, "What is this feeling trying to show me?" Instead of running from the void, you turn toward it with genuine curiosity, and what you discover there will astound you. The emptiness isn't empty at all. It's full of potential, pregnant with possibilities you haven't yet imagined. It's the space where your unlived life is waiting to be born. But accessing this potential requires you to develop what Jung called negative capability, the ability to remain present with uncertainty without irritably reaching after fact and reason. This means learning to sit with questions that don't have immediate answers. It means being comfortable with not knowing what comes next. It means trusting that your psyche has its own intelligence, its own timing, its own way of revealing what you need to know when you need to know it. But here's what makes this process so challenging. Your ego, the part of you that's been running the show for so long, interprets this surrender as death. It believes that if you stop controlling, stop pushing, stop trying to make things happen, everything will fall apart. The ego equates emptiness with annihilation. But Jung discovered that the ego's fear is based on a fundamental misunderstanding. What the ego experiences as death, the self experiences as birth. What feels like loss of control is actually the emergence of a deeper kind of guidance. What seems like emptiness is actually fullness in its most pure form. But to access this deeper wisdom, you have to be willing to let the ego's version of control die. This is perhaps the most terrifying part of the journey, because it means releasing your grip on the familiar, even when the familiar is painful. It means trusting something you can't see, can't measure, can't control. It means having faith in a process that makes no rational sense. Jung himself went through this dark night of the soul during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. For months, he felt like he was losing his mind. His dreams were filled with terrifying images. His waking life was plagued by visions and fantasies that seemed to come from nowhere. But instead of trying to make these experiences stop, he did something revolutionary. He began to engage with them actively. He started keeping what would later become known as the Red Book, a record of his dialogues with the figures that appeared in his imagination. He painted, he sculpted, he built stone structures with his hands. He treated his psychological symptoms not as problems to be solved, but as communications from parts of himself that had been silenced for too long. And slowly, something remarkable began to happen. The terrifying images began to reveal their deeper meaning. The chaotic emotions began to organize themselves into patterns. The emptiness began to show its creative potential. What had felt like psychological breakdown was actually psychological breakthrough. This is the secret Jung discovered about desire and emptiness. They're not opposites. They're dance partners. Desire without emptiness becomes compulsion. Emptiness without desire becomes depression. But when they work together, when they're allowed to inform each other, they create something entirely new. They create what Jung called the transcendent function, the bridge between conscious and unconscious that allows for genuine psychological transformation. But activating this function requires a specific kind of attention. Not the scattered attention of someone trying to escape discomfort, but the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in understanding. It's the difference between looking at your desires and looking into them. The difference between trying to satisfy your cravings and trying to understand what they're really asking for. When you develop this quality of attention, you begin to notice things you've never seen before. You start to recognize the patterns beneath your patterns. You see how your current desires are often echoes of much older needs, wounds that were never properly tended, parts of yourself that were rejected or abandoned long ago. This recognition is both painful and liberating. Painful because it reveals the depth of your disconnection from yourself. Liberating because it shows you exactly what needs to be healed. Your desires stop being random impulses and start being a precise map of your psychological landscape. But reading this map requires a different kind of literacy. It requires you to understand the symbolic language of the psyche. Jung discovered that the unconscious doesn't communicate in words or logic. It communicates in images, emotions, sensations, dreams, and yes, desires. Learning to translate this language is like learning to speak with a part of yourself you've never met. This translation process happens through what Jung called active imagination. Instead of trying to think your way through your cravings, you learn to feel your way through them. Instead of analyzing your desires, you begin to dialogue with them. You ask them questions. You listen to their responses. You treat them as if they were separate beings with their own intelligence and their own agenda. This might sound strange, even crazy, but Jung discovered that when you approach your psyche in this way, remarkable things begin to happen. The compulsive quality of desire begins to fade. The desperate reaching for external solutions starts to quiet. And in that quietness, you begin to hear something you've been missing all along. Your desires begin to reveal their deeper purpose. The craving for stimulation shows itself to be a longing for aliveness. The need for validation transforms into a desire for authentic self-expression. The compulsive seeking becomes a sacred search for meaning and connection. But this transformation doesn't happen through effort or will. It happens through attention and patience. It happens by learning to be present with your experience exactly as it is, without trying to change it or fix it or make it different. It happens by developing what Jung called a religious attitude toward your own psychological process. This doesn't mean becoming passive or resigned. It means recognizing that your psyche has its own intelligence, its own healing capacity, its own way of moving toward wholeness. Your job isn't to control this process, but to support it, to create the conditions where natural healing can occur. And what are those conditions? Primarily, they involve learning to be alone with yourself without immediately reaching for distraction. They involve developing the capacity to sit with difficult emotions without numbing them or acting them out. They involve cultivating curiosity about your inner world instead of judgment or fear. This is where the real work begins, not in trying to eliminate desire or fill emptiness, but in learning to be present with both. in discovering that the very things you've been running from might actually be the doorways to everything you've been looking for. Because what Jung discovered in those dark months of confrontation wasn't just a personal breakthrough. It was a universal truth about human nature that most of us never learn. The emptiness we fear, the void we try to fill with endless consumption and stimulation, isn't our enemy. It's our birthright. It's the space where our authentic self is waiting to emerge. But accessing this space requires something our culture rarely teaches us. It requires the courage to be bored, to sit in silence without reaching for your phone, to feel the ache of longing without immediately trying to satisfy it, to experience the full weight of your own existence without cushioning it with distractions. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the dark night of the soul. It's not a punishment or a pathology. It's an initiation, a rite of passage that every human being must eventually navigate if they want to discover who they really are beneath all the roles and masks and performances. Most people avoid this initiation at all costs. They fill their lives with so much noise, so much activity, so much stimulation that they never have to encounter the silence where transformation lives. But the cost of this avoidance is enormous. They spend their entire lives chasing shadows, seeking in the outer world what can only be found in the inner landscape. Your desires have been trying to lead you to this inner landscape all along. Every craving, every compulsion, every moment of desperate reaching has been your psyche's way of saying, pay attention. There's something here you need to see. But instead of looking where your desires are pointing, you've been looking at the desires themselves. It's like mistaking the finger for the moon. The desire isn't the destination. It's the signpost. And what it's pointing toward isn't another experience, another person, another achievement. It's pointing toward the part of you that's been waiting in the darkness for your return. This is the great reversal Jung discovered. We think we're hungry for more when we're actually starving for less. Less distraction, less stimulation, less running from ourselves. We think we need to fill the emptiness when what we actually need is to empty ourselves further. To clear out all the false identities, all the borrowed dreams, all the ways we've learned to be someone other than who we really are. But this emptying process is terrifying because it means letting go of everything you've used to define yourself. Your achievements, your relationships, your beliefs about who you're supposed to be. It means standing naked before the mystery of your own existence and admitting that you don't know who you are without all these external identifications. Jung called this the dark night of the soul, but he also called it the pearl of great price. Because what you discover in that darkness, what emerges from that emptiness, is more precious than anything you could acquire in the external world. You discover your authentic self. Not the self you think you should be, not the self others expect you to be, but the self you actually are when all the pretense falls away. This authentic self doesn't need to be filled because it's already whole. It doesn't need to be validated because it knows its own worth. It doesn't need to consume because it's connected to the source of all nourishment. And when you're rooted in this deeper identity, desire transforms completely. Instead of desperate grasping, it becomes gentle guidance. Instead of compulsive seeking, it becomes creative expression. Instead of trying to fill a void, it becomes an overflow of fullness. This is what Jung meant by individuation. Not self-improvement, but self-recovery. Not becoming someone new, but remembering who you've always been. But here's what makes this process so challenging in our modern world. Everything in our culture is designed to keep you running from this encounter with yourself. The constant notifications, the endless entertainment options, the pressure to stay busy and productive and distracted. We live in a civilization that profits from your disconnection from your authentic self. Breaking free from this system requires more than just willpower. It requires a fundamental shift in how you understand the purpose of life itself. Instead of seeing life as something to be optimized and controlled and maximized, you begin to see it as something to be experienced and felt and lived fully. Instead of trying to avoid suffering, you learn to extract wisdom from it. Instead of running from emptiness, you discover the creative potential that lives within it. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process of learning to trust your own inner guidance instead of looking outside yourself for direction. It's learning to value depth over stimulation, presence over productivity, being over doing. It's discovering that the very qualities our culture dismisses as weaknesses might actually be your greatest strengths. Your sensitivity isn't a flaw to be fixed. It's a gift that allows you to perceive subtleties others miss. Your emptiness isn't a void to be filled. It's a space where new possibilities can emerge. Your desires aren't enemies to be conquered. They're messengers carrying vital information about what your soul needs to thrive. When you begin to see your psychological experience in this way, everything changes. The symptoms you've been trying to eliminate become teachers. The patterns you've been trying to break become doorways. The emptiness you've been trying to escape becomes the very place where you finally come home to yourself. This is Jung's ultimate gift to humanity. Not a cure for the human condition, but a way of understanding it that transforms suffering into meaning, emptiness into potential, desire into guidance. He showed us that we don't need to fix ourselves because we were never broken. We just forgot how to listen to the wisdom that's been trying to reach us all along. Your desires will never stop arising. The emptiness will never be permanently filled. But when you understand what they're really trying to communicate, when you learn to be present with them instead of running from them, they stop being problems and start being allies in your journey toward wholeness. The void you've been running from isn't empty. It's pregnant with everything you've been looking for. And the desires you've been fighting aren't obstacles to your peace. They're invitations to come home to the fullness that's been waiting inside you all along. This is where the real journey begins, not in the desperate pursuit of more, but in the courageous embrace of what is, and not in the frantic filling of emptiness, but in the patient discovery of what that emptiness is trying to birth. Your authentic self has been calling to you through every craving, every longing, every moment of restless dissatisfaction. Are you finally ready to listen?